He was just a janitor in a worn military coat, standing trial for stealing bread and milk, until the judge read his name. Then everything changed. What started as a petty theft case soon unraveled into a forgotten war story, a buried act of heroism, and a courtroom moment that would leave an entire town in stunned silence. Behind every charge is a man. Behind this one, a promise, a daughter, and a past the world had chosen to forget. The December wind cut across the small town like broken glass, rattling the loose tin of the grocery store's awning and pushing fine snow under the door with every gust. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed over shelves half empty from the holiday rush. Brandon Cole stood in the narrow bread aisle, one calloused hand gripping the last loaf like it was a lifeline. His coat, once Marine Corps olive, now dulled and frayed, hung heavy with melted snow. He had buttoned it high to hide the janitor's shirt underneath, but nothing could hide the way his fingers trembled as he read the price tag again and again. $3.29. It might as well have been $30. In his other hand, he held a small bottle of milk, expiration date, stamped like a deadline. Sophie was at home with a fever, cheeks flushed and eyes glassy. He'd promised her pancakes in the morning, the kind her mother used to make. Promises to a 12-year-old, especially to a 12-year-old who had lost her mother, weren't things you broke. He checked his wallet one more time. 2 crumpled singles of bus transfer and a faded photo of Sophie wearing his Marine cap, sideways grinning. He pressed his thumb to the photo like it might give him courage. The register at the front chimed as another customer left. The store clerk, a boy young enough to be one of Brandon's former students at the high school, where he now mopped floors, leaned on the counter scrolling his phone. Brandon glanced at the security camera in the corner. He knew how this looked. 42 years old. No credit card. A war veteran holding bread and milk like a thief rehearsing his crime. But the image of Sophie coughing in her sleep pushed every thought of dignity aside. He moved to the counter, setting the items down. "Could you run this first?" he asked softly. Holding out the milk, the boy scanned it. $2.25. Brandon handed over his $2, then dug into his pocket for change. He came up with 16 cents. "Still short," the boy said, glancing at the bread. "You sure you want that, too?" Brandon looked at the loaf, then at the milk. Pancakes needed both. Sophie needed both. "I'll come back for the bread," he murmured, trying to slide it aside. Behind him, a woman in a fur-lined coat scoffed. "Some people can't even afford bread. This town's going downhill." Heat climbed his neck. His hands curled around the loaf again without thinking. In Fallujah, he had once lifted a burning beam off a trapped soldier, with less effort than it took now to lift his chin and look the boy in the eye. "Please," he said. "I'll bring the rest tomorrow. I get paid Friday." "Store policy," the boy said, not unkindly, but unmoved. "I can't." The next thing Brandon knew, the cold air outside was biting his face, and the loaf and the milk were clutched to his chest. The door's chime echoed behind him. Maybe he'd left the cash on the counter, maybe not. His boots crunched the ice-slick sidewalk as if moving by themselves. "Sir," a voice barked. "Hey, stop." Brandon kept walking, each step heavier. "Sophie. Just get back to Sophie." But before he reached the corner, a hand caught his arm. "Drop it," the voice commanded. 2 uniformed officers stood under the streetlight. One was young, his breath puffing white. The other, older, had eyes as cold as the snow. "It's just bread and milk," Brandon said quietly. "My daughter, you're under arrest for shoplifting," the older officer interrupted, already pulling cuffs from his belt. Brandon's shoulders sagged. He thought of running, but didn't. He thought of explaining, but the words lodged in his throat. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, metal biting his skin through the coat. "Daddy," he turned his head sharply. Sophie was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, hair messy under her knitted hat, face pale. She'd followed him probably when he left for the store. Her eyes, so like her mother's, widened as the officer held him. "Go home," Sophie Brandon said. Voice steady, though his heart slammed against his ribs. "I'll be back soon." She didn't move. "You didn't do anything," she whispered. "It's okay, baby." He tried to smile, but it broke halfway. "Go inside before you get cold." The older officer nudged him toward the squad car. Snowflakes clung to the cuffs like tiny handcuffs of their own. Brandon caught Sophie's gaze one more time, silently pleading with her not to cry. But she did. Inside the squad car, the heater hummed. Brandon stared at his reflection in the plexiglass divider, a janitor's shirt, a Marine's coat, a father's eyes. In his lap lay the small photograph of Sophie and the dog tag he had worn through 2 deployments. He slipped the tag over his fingers, its edges worn smooth by years of touching whenever nightmares came. "Do you know what happens now?" the younger officer asked almost gently. "Yes," Brandon said. "I've been to court before." "Not like this, you haven't," the older one muttered, flipping through the incident report. "Bread and milk. Pathetic." Brandon said nothing. Outside, Sophie stood alone in the snow arms, wrapped around herself, watching the car pull away. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he saw not the store or the street, but a desert sky, the color of copper sawdust. Dry wind blowing through a broken wall, a young man crying for help under rubble. He saw himself running back into the blast zone to pull him free. A promise whispered over the dying, "I won't let you be left behind." He opened his eyes as the squad car turned toward the county jail. His wrists ached, but his chest hurt more. Back at the house, Sophie would be standing at the window, alone, hungry, scared. And yet even now, he felt a strange, stubborn calm settle in his bones. He had survived worse. He had survived war. He would survive this for her. As the jail loomed ahead, its windows glowing like watchful eyes, Brandon held the dog, tag tight in his fist, and whispered an apology to the memory of his wife. "I tried," he murmured. "I'm still trying." The car rolled through the gates, and the snow swallowed their tracks behind them. The jail cell was no bigger than a walk-in closet, lit by a single buzzing fluorescent light that flickered every few seconds, just enough to keep sleep forever out of reach. The floor was hard concrete, stained with stories no one cared to tell. The thin bench along the wall pressed against Brandon's spine, like it resented his presence. But he didn't shift. He barely blinked. He had sat through worse. His hands, though, no longer cuffed, still bore the red imprints of restraint. He rubbed his wrist absently, his thumb brushing over the skin where his watch used to be, before the pawn shop had taken it for just enough gas money to get Sophie to school that week. A low cough echoed from the cell down the hallway. Somewhere, a door slammed. A drunk yelled for his mother. The smell of bleach couldn't quite cover the staleness of hopelessness soaked into every wall. Brandon sat still, back straight, like a Marine head bowed like a father. His coat had been taken, his dog tag, too. It now lay somewhere in an evidence bag, impersonal and ignored. His call to Sophie had lasted 30 seconds, just enough to hear her voice crack on the other end, then the cold click of the social worker who had picked her up. "You can't keep her overnight," he had said. "She's not safe alone, sir. I am her safety." The line had gone dead. Now he sat in silence, replaying that moment again and again. Outside the bars, the world turned without him. A soft shuffle of footsteps broke the monotony. A figure paused outside his cell. A female officer, mid-30s, auburn hair, tied tight, uniform crisp. Her name tag read, Danvers. She didn't speak right away, just looked at him through the bars like she wasn't sure if she recognized him or wanted to. "You served?" she finally asked, quiet. Brandon's eyes flicked up to meet hers. Yeah, Branch Marines, 3rd Battalion, Fallujah. Her expression shifted subtly. Respect, or maybe caution. My brother was Army. Baghdad. Brandon nodded once. In this place, military service was like a secret handshake, unspoken, but understood. Danvers stepped closer. You had a tag on you. Silver beat up, said Cole Brandon Essie on the back. That yours? He didn't answer right away. Yeah. She hesitated, saw something etched on the edge. For Sophie. Always. Brandon looked down. His voice was almost a whisper. It's the last thing she sees before school every day. She checks it in my shirt pocket like it's a lucky coin. Silence stretched between them. Danvers cleared her throat. Just thought you'd want to know we're assigning you public defense for your arraignment. Tomorrow morning, Judge Beckett's on the bench. Brandon stiffened slightly. Beckett. She nodded. He's fair. Tough, but fair. Brandon let out a slow breath. The name stirred something, but he pushed it aside. Danvers looked like she wanted to say more. Then, deciding against it, she turned to leave. Get some sleep, Cole. Sleep. He almost laughed. Instead, he waited until her footsteps faded. Then he reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, not for a prayer. Just a photo. Worn soft at the edges, folded 4 times like a map of his heart. Sophie, age 9 in the picture, standing beside her mother on the hospital lawn, both grinning. The scarf around Sophie's neck had been his USMC standard issue. He ran a finger down the edge of the photo, then pressed it to his chest like armor. He thought of Marissa, his wife gone 3 winters now, a botched surgery at a VA hospital. Complications, they'd called it. Bureaucratic code for, we failed her, but no one's responsible. He had screamed in that hallway, not out of rage, but because Sophie had asked, where's Mommy? And Brandon, the war hero, the rescue specialist, the man who once stared down enemy fire, didn't have an answer. That was the night he stopped believing the system would ever save him. But he never stopped believing in Sophie. That was the difference. That's why he was in this cell now. That's why the bread and milk had never been about food. It was about keeping a promise made at a graveside with frozen roses, and a child too young to understand why everyone was wearing black. I'll keep her fed. I'll keep her warm. I'll never let her feel abandoned. He had whispered those vows with trembling lips and a shattered heart. He hadn't broken that promise. Not until tonight. Somewhere, another door slammed. A man cursed. Another sobbed. Brandon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, letting his head fall into his hands. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the day Marissa died. But something in him cracked, like the quiet groan of ice giving way under too much weight. He wasn't ashamed of what he'd done. He was ashamed that he'd had to do it. Time passed, slow, meaningless. Then a faint knock echoed at the end of the hallway. Keys jingled. Another officer appeared, a different one this time. Young, nervous. Cole Brandon looked up. Got someone here to see you. Lawyer. Said she was sent by some veterans group. Brandon frowned. I didn't request one yet. She says she's not waiting for a request. As the officer stepped aside, a tall woman in a dark navy coat entered. Her presence was sharp composed, like a blade in a velvet sheath. Her hair was pulled into a loose twist, and her eyes were the kind that didn't miss much. I'm Cassandra Brooks, she said, pulling a small folder from her bag. Call me Cassie. I'm with the Veterans Legal Protection Network. I'll be representing you tomorrow. Brandon straightened on instinct. I don't have money, till she raised a hand. You don't need it. You've paid enough already. Their eyes locked. In hers, he saw something different from pity. It was a recognition, the kind that only comes from shared shadows. I read the incident report, she continued. It's thin. The theft, the value, the context. It all matters. More importantly, you matter." He said nothing, but his shoulders dropped half an inch. Cassie looked at him carefully. "You've been through hell. You're not alone in this anymore, Mr. Cole." Brandon stared at her, unsure of what to say. 3 years of fighting for benefits, 2 years of cleaning toilets at a high school, and 1 bad night had taught him not to expect lifelines. But now, in the flickering light of a cold jail cell, something had shifted. Not much, just enough to hope. The courthouse stood like a monument to justice, or at least the idea of it. Gray stone steps led up to double doors that hadn't seen fresh paint since the last administration, and the American flag overhead snapped sharply in the winter wind, defiant against the clouds. Inside, heat hissed from old radiators, but it did little to warm the wide marble lobby. People huddled in corners, lawyers reviewing notes, defendants stealing nervous glances at their watches, and officers trading gossip beneath stained glass windows that depicted Lady Justice blindfolded, one scale, broken clean off. Brandon Cole stood quietly near the back, his shoulders hunched beneath the same olive-green military coat he'd worn through 2 tours and countless storms. But today, the weight didn't come from snow or memories, it came from eyes. People watched him, not because they knew him, not yet, but because a man in cuffs escorted through the courthouse always draws stares, especially one dressed like he had walked out of a history book and into the wrong decade. Cassie Brooks walked beside him, her stride purposeful. She wore a charcoal suit and boots, with no nonsense in the heel. As they passed the security checkpoint, she glanced at him. "You doing okay?" Brandon didn't answer right away. "I hate courtrooms," he finally muttered. Cassie nodded. Most honest people do. They reached the door to courtroom 3B. A small brass plaque read, "The Honorable Charles Beckett." Cassie turned toward Brandon and pulled a tie from her satchel. "Put this on. Judges respect effort." He looked at it like it was a foreign object. "Been a long time since I wore one of these." Cassie smiled softly. Muscle memory. He took it, fumbled with the knot, and finally gave up. She stepped in, adjusted it for him. For a brief second, her hands lingered near his collar, and she noticed something, the faint outline of a tattoo peeking through the open top button. A shadow of a serpent coiled beneath the wing of an eagle. She didn't comment. "Ready?" she asked. "No," Brandon said honestly. "But let's go anyway." Inside the courtroom, the air was sharp with formality. The judge hadn't arrived yet, but the benches were already half full. Local reporters scribbled in notepads. A few veterans sat in the back. Ball caps and hand eyes guarded. Brandon scanned the room until he saw her. Sophie. She sat near the back feet, barely touching the floor, bundled in her purple coat, a social worker beside her. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and she started to stand, but the woman next to her gently pulled her back. Cassie noticed too. She shouldn't be here. Brandon's jaw tightened. She came anyway. The bailiff called all rise, and the room stood in a rustle of coats and creaking wood as Judge Beckett entered. A tall man, silver-haired, but still broad-shouldered. He wore his robe like it had been tailored into his skin. His eyes swept the room with professional detachment. Brandon's name was called. He stepped forward, flanked by Cassie, and stood at the defense table. Judge Beckett adjusted his glasses, opened a folder, and began scanning. Brandon Samuel Cole, charged with misdemeanor theft, resisting detainment. Items listed 1 loaf of bread, 1 pint of milk. A few people chuckled under their breath. Prosecution, the judge asked. Scott Bruner stood a young, clean-shaven ADA with slicked hair and the quiet arrogance of someone who had never missed a mortgage payment or skipped a meal. Your Honor, this case is simple. The defendant stole from a local business. Regardless of circumstance, theft is theft. We're seeking a fine probation and a public apology to deter future offenses. Cassie rose. Your Honor, the defendant is a decorated Marine, Bronze Star, honorable discharge, single father, no priors. The items in question were purchased out of desperation, not malice. Beckett didn't react. He reached for a paperclip, fumbled slightly, and almost absent-mindedly Brandon's dog tag slipped from the file and landed on the bench with a small clink. The judge froze. His eyes dropped to the tag. For a moment he didn't move. Then he picked it up, slowly, turned it over, and read the back. His hand trembled. For Sophie. Always. Beckett's face went pale. His breath hitched almost imperceptibly. Across the room, Cassie narrowed her eyes. Something had shifted. Brandon noticed too, but he couldn't place it. The courtroom was silent. The heater groaned. The judge stood suddenly, hands gripping the bench. We'll take a short recess, Beckett said abruptly. 10 minutes. Then he turned and walked through the door behind the bench, not looking back. The room stirred like someone had opened a window. People whispered. The bailiff looked uncertain. Cassie leaned toward Brandon. What just happened? I don't know, he said, slowly, but someone in the courtroom did. Sophie. The moment the judge left, she jumped to her feet and rushed to the front. He's not a thief, she cried out, her voice high and breaking. He's not my dad. He's a hero. The room turned to her. A few snickered. One reporter raised a camera. He was in the war, Sophie continued, tears streaking her cheeks. He saved people. He saved me. He was just hungry. Okay. I was sick, and we didn't have food. The social worker tried to pull her back, but Sophie resisted. You're all laughing, but you don't know. He's the bravest person in the world, and you treat him like garbage. Silence. Not laughter, not mocking, just stunned, shamed silence. Cassie moved toward Sophie gently. Sweetheart, come with me. Sophie's lower lip quivered, but she allowed herself to be led away. As they sat in the back, Brandon looked over his shoulder, eyes glassy. Cassie whispered, She's stronger than most people twice her age. Brandon didn't reply. He just nodded once, an acknowledgement, a thank you, and an apology, all wrapped into one. When Judge Beckett returned minutes later, his face was composed again, but not cold. He sat down, looked at Brandon, then at Sophie, and then back to the dog tag resting in front of him. He didn't speak. But the courtroom knew something had changed. The courtroom had returned to stillness, but the air felt heavier now, like something invisible had settled over the room, pressing against skin and thought alike. No one spoke. Even the radiators seemed to hush. Judge Charles Beckett sat motionless on the bench, his gavel untouched. He wasn't reading from the case file anymore. He wasn't even looking at the defendant. His gaze had fixed on a small, battered piece of metal resting before him, the dog tag. The name on it echoed through his mind like a gunshot inside a cathedral, Brandon Samuel Cole. His fingers brushed the edge of the tag again. It was worn smooth, the letters almost faded. But it wasn't the tag that haunted him. It was the sound of that name. Cole. The judge's vision blurred for a moment, and suddenly, he wasn't in a courtroom. He was 27 again. Sand clung to his lips, and smoke curled through the sky over Fallujah. The shouts of Marines echoed through the ruined street. Gunfire rattled like a death march, and he lay bleeding beneath the shattered hull of a Humvee. He remembered screaming for help, coughing blood, thinking it was the end. And then, through the chaos, a hand. A young corporal face, streaked with ash, had crawled through the fire, dragging him out by the collar, yelling over the noise. I've got you, sir. You're not dying here. That man's name, Corporal Cole Beckett whispered. The courtroom didn't hear it, but he heard it. Brandon, standing quietly at the defense table, straightened just slightly. His eyes locked with Beckett's. Something passed between them. Confusion, recognition history. Beckett cleared his throat, but it didn't help. His voice was dry as parchment. Recess extended. "We'll resume in 20. He stood abruptly. "Your Honor," the bailiff asked, confused. Beckett didn't answer. He simply gathered the dog tag, and case file turned and disappeared through the door behind the bench. Whispers erupted like a wave. Cassie leaned toward Brandon. "Okay, what just happened?" Brandon's brow was furrowed. "I don't know, but..." He looked like he saw a ghost. Cassie glanced toward the bench. No, not a ghost. A memory. Inside the judge's chambers, Beckett shut the door behind him and leaned against it, as if bracing for impact. His hands trembled as he opened the folder again and scanned the documents. Brandon Samuel Cole. Honorably discharged. Bronze Star. Stationed Fallujah, 2004. It was him. The man who had pulled him out of the fire, who had braced his shattered leg with torn uniform strips and stayed with him through the medevac while rounds exploded all around. Beckett had never forgotten the moment, but he had forgotten the name. And now that name stood before him in handcuffs, charged with stealing a loaf of bread and a pint of milk. The judge moved to the window and stared out over the snowy courthouse lawn. Veterans' graves lay just beyond the line of trees. He'd presided over too many burial flags, saluted too many folded corners. And yet the man who had saved his life, the man whose voice still echoed in nightmares and prayers alike, had slipped through the cracks of the very system Beckett had sworn to uphold. He turned back to the dog tag in his hand. For Sophie. Always. A whisper of guilt threaded through his chest. What kind of country meddles its heroes and lets them beg for bread 15 years later? On the shelf behind his desk sat a photo, a younger Charles Beckett in uniform beside a dozen Marines in dusty fatigues. He picked it up and looked closer. There, fifth, from the left, squinting into the sun. Brandon. The jaw was the same. The eyes. The same quiet strength even then. Beckett exhaled slowly. He hadn't been just a face from war. He'd been the face. The one who saved his life. Back in the courtroom, Sophie sat, curled on the bench, her head resting against Cassie's coat sleeve. She hadn't spoken since her outburst. Her small hand clutched a knitted scarf frayed at the ends her father's. Her eyes darted to the empty judge's bench, worried. Cassie offered her a warm smile. "He'll be back." "Is he mad?" Sophie asked, voice trembling. "No, sweetheart. I think he remembered something important." 20 minutes later, the courtroom doors opened. Judge Beckett entered, but something was different. His robe looked heavier, his steps slower. He took his seat with deliberate care, then adjusted the microphone in front of him. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at Brandon, then at Sophie, and finally at the courtroom full of strangers who didn't yet understand they were witnessing something rare, a moment when justice remembered its own humanity. Judge Beckett's voice, when it came, was low but steady. This court was prepared to hear a simple theft case today. A misdemeanor, a loaf of bread, and a pint of milk. Nothing that usually draws a crowd or headlines. He paused. The room leaned in. But what I see before me now is not a thief. It is a man I owe my life to. Gasps. Whispers. Brandon's eyes narrowed. Judge Beckett continued, his voice cracking slightly. "In Fallujah, I was a young lieutenant caught in a mortar blast. I would have died that day if not for a corporal who risked his life to drag me out. He stayed with me while enemy fire shook the sky. He tore his uniform to stop the bleeding. He didn't run. He looked directly at Brandon. 'That corporal was you, Mr. Cole.' Brandon's lips parted, but no words came. I didn't know. Beckett's voice faltered. 'I didn't recognize you. I'm ashamed of that.' The courtroom was silent. Sophie sat bolt upright, eyes wide. Beckett leaned forward. This is not how our nation should treat its heroes, and I intend to do everything in my power to make that right. Beginning now. He stood an unprecedented move during an active session and stepped down from the bench. He walked slowly, purposefully, until he stood in front of Brandon. Then, without ceremony, he extended his hand. Thank you for your service, and for my life. Brandon hesitated, then reached out. Their hands met in a firm, wordless clasp. The room didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It simply held its breath. And then, as if cued by something sacred, everyone in the room, every single person, rose silently to their feet. Not in applause, but in reverence. Because some silences are louder than thunder. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Judge Charles Beckett, muffling the murmurs still rippling through the courtroom. He stood in his private chambers, surrounded by dark paneled walls, lined with shelves of legal tomes, some unread for years. The room was silent, but inside him, war drums had started to beat again. He walked slowly to his desk, sat down, and placed the dog tag on the polished surface, as if it were an artifact, pulled from a battlefield grave. In many ways, it was. His reflection stared back at him from the gleaming desk. The man looking at him wore a robe of authority, but behind the stern jawline and silver hair, he saw the boyish lieutenant who had once believed in clean lines between right and wrong. That was before Fallujah. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a manila envelope he hadn't touched in years. Inside were photos, grainy, sun-bleached images of his unit, Marines sitting on sandbags, helmets tilted back, dirt on their faces, but something like hope still in their eyes. He flipped through them until he found the one he hadn't been able to look at for more than a second, not since the day it was mailed to him by a corpsman months after the blast. It showed Brandon Cole, young, lean, dust-covered, standing beside the mangled Humvee that had nearly become Beckett's coffin. He was holding a tourniquet in one hand, and with the other, he was giving a silent thumbs up to the medevac team landing in the background. Beckett stared at the photo until his eyes burned. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in over a decade. Franklin VA Records came the voice on the other end. This is Judge Charles Beckett. I need an expedited search into the service record and post-discharge claims history of a Marine Corporal Brandon Samuel Cole. Authorization code Alpha 12907. A pause. Understood. Anything in particular? Your Honor, any VA rejections, claims, denied benefits, missed appeals, and cross-check his name against the medal board. I want to know why a Bronze Star recipient is standing trial in my courtroom for stealing bread. We'll pull everything. Beckett ended the call and leaned back in his chair. His hand gripped the armrest like it was a rifle stock. The memories came uninvited. He remembered the medevac chopper lifting off the wind, whipping sand into his eyes as he bled through his uniform. He remembered grabbing Brandon's wrist, whispering over the rotors. Tell my wife I tried to make it home. Brandon had smiled just barely. You will. And somehow Beckett had. But what about the man who saved him? Later that evening, Beckett remained in chambers long after the courthouse had emptied. The halls outside were dark, echoing only with the faint click of janitors' carts and distant office phones left to ring unanswered. He sat at his desk again, the dog tag still in front of him when his desk phone lit up. The records had arrived. Go ahead, he said into the receiver, bracing himself. Your Honor. The clerk's voice said softly. We're sending the full file to your secure email. But I thought you should know one thing first. Beckett's heart tightened. Yes, Corporal Cole submitted multiple claims to the VA after his discharge. PTSD, spousal health coverage, death benefits when his wife passed during surgery. They were all rejected Beckett swallowed. Why, the initial paperwork listed a wrong procedural code, some data entry glitch. And then after the first denial, he missed the appeal deadline. By how much? 3 days, sir. He filed it the morning after his wife's funeral. Beckett closed his eyes. His voice dropped to a whisper, and no one reinstated it. No, sir. Policy's strict. Once the window closes, it closes. He thanked the clerk and ended the call, but the shame remained thick in his chest. He looked down at the tag again. For Sophie. Always. 3 days. 3 days of grief had cost Brandon Cole everything: his medical care, his support, his dignity. The same system that had pinned a medal to his chest had turned its back on him when he needed it most. Beckett rose from his chair and went to the bookshelf behind him, pulling out a dusty leather binder marked Veteran Resources and Civil Code. He flipped rapidly through the pages, scanning clauses, annotations, exceptions. He wasn't just a judge now. He was a man reclaiming a debt. At that moment, in a government holding room just 2 floors below, Brandon sat on a bench coat draped over his lap, staring blankly at the scuffed linoleum tiles. Cassie stood beside him, pacing. "You all right?" she asked for the 3rd time. Brandon nodded faintly. Cassie watched him for a moment, then finally said, "You know the judge recognized you, right?" Brandon exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I knew the second he looked at me." "You saved his life." He nodded again. "Long time ago. Another life." Cassie sat down beside him. "You remember everything, don't you?" "I remember he cried when I pulled him out of the wreck. Not out of pain, out of fear. I remember telling him he'd see his wife again. I believed it. Back then." She looked at him closely. "You don't anymore." He didn't answer. After a moment, Cassie reached into her briefcase and pulled out a copy of the VA rejections she'd just received from a contact of her own. "I know about the denied claims. The appeal you filed after Marissa passed. The 3-day delay." Brandon's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Cassie continued, her voice steady. "We're going to fight it. Not just the theft charge. Everything. We're reopening your VA case. We're going to get your benefits reinstated, Brandon. Your housing, medical, everything you earned." He looked at her, not with hope. Not yet, but with the weary curiosity of a man who had long stopped expecting help. "Why now?" he asked quietly. Cassie took a deep breath. "Because someone finally remembered who you are." Cassandra Brooks drove through the snowfall with the windshield wipers ticking like a metronome of tension. The courthouse was fading behind her, but the image of Brandon Cole's face remained vivid, etched into her mind, like a scar she'd never earned. She hadn't meant to take this case. When the call came from the Veterans Legal Protection Network that morning, she was packing boxes. Her fellowship was ending in 2 weeks. A firm in Chicago had offered her a full-time position corner office salary, with more zeros than she ever thought she'd see. Her life was supposed to be moving forward. But then she'd heard the name. Brandon Samuel Cole. And something inside her had gone still. At the next red light, Cassie pulled over and opened the glove compartment. Inside was an old bundle of letters, some yellowed with time, others barely unfolded. They were her father's, written in neat block letters postmarked from Iraq. He had died in a car accident before she ever got to ask about those years, but she'd kept the letters like relics. She slid one out at random and began to read, her breath catching as the memory returned. "We had a guy transfer in last week, Corporal Brandon Cole. Quiet, but solid. The kind you'd trust to hold a line or carry you out if things went sideways. Reminds me of myself when I still believed in the system." Cassie closed her eyes. Brandon wasn't just another client. He was someone her father had respected, admired, trusted. And now he was standing in a courtroom with cuffs on, reduced to headlines and pity. Not under her watch. She arrived at the county records office just before closing. The clerk behind the desk wore an expression that suggested he hated both people and fluorescent lighting in equal measure. "I'm looking for all public records tied to Brandon Samuel Cole," Cassie said, placing her credentials on the desk. "Military commendations, property holdings, VA correspondence, anything you've got." The man squinted. "You his lawyer?" "Yes," she said more firmly than she felt. "Pro bono. I'm authorized." He grunted and shuffled into the back room. While she waited, Cassie wandered toward the community bulletin board. Missing pets bake sales support group flyers. One caught her eye: Veterans Coffee Circle, every Sunday. 9 a.m. All branches welcome. A picture showed a few elderly men in folding chairs holding chipped mugs and staring out over a park bench. This town remembers its veterans until they need something. The clerk returned with a stack of files and handed them over, found more in the overflow. Poor guy got buried in red tape. She took the folders and nodded her thanks. That night at her apartment, she sat cross-legged on the floor with records spread around her like a paper battlefield. Her laptop screen glowed with open tabs, VA policy codes, appeal deadlines, medical exemptions. Brandon's story emerged in fragments. A commendation for valor in 2004, signed by a general. A letter from a former commanding officer praising him as the reason 5 of us came home. A denied benefits form, stamped in bold, insufficient documentation. A handwritten appeal scrawled in a shaking hand, dated 3 days after Marissa Cole's funeral. Cassie paused when she found a photo tucked into one of the older folders. Sophie, maybe 6 years old, grinning with 2 missing teeth, sitting on her father's shoulders. Something cracked inside her. It was the look on Brandon's face in the photo, tired but anchored, like the little girl on his shoulders wasn't just his daughter, but the last weight worth carrying. Cassie leaned back against the wall, eyes wet. For years she had fought to keep her distance from clients. Compassion was a liability in law. Emotions clouded strategy. But Brandon Cole wasn't just a client. He was a wound her country had inflicted and forgotten. The next morning, Cassie walked into Judge Beckett's office with purpose. He was already reviewing Brandon's file, eyes bloodshot, sleeves rolled to the elbow. "You couldn't sleep either?" she asked. Beckett looked up. "No. I found the same appeal you did," Cassie said. 3 days late, handwritten, no legal counsel. The VA closed the door on him because he was grieving too slowly. Beckett's jaw clenched. "We failed him." Cassie sat across from him. "We can do more than just clear his name. We can make this right. His benefits can be restored, and I believe we can build a retroactive compensation case." Beckett nodded slowly. "I've already called the governor's office. They're listening." A beat of silence passed between them. Then Beckett added, "You're a good lawyer, Ms. Brooks. But this one's personal, isn't it?" Cassie hesitated. Then quietly, "My father was an Army medic. He died stateside. But he served with men like Brandon. He wrote about Brandon. I grew up thinking heroes wore capes until I realized they wore boots and dog tags." Beckett leaned back. "Then let's give this hero what the system took away." That afternoon, Cassie visited Brandon in the holding facility once more. He looked thinner in the light gaunt beneath the scruff and shadows, but his eyes still had that quiet steadiness. "I found the paperwork," she said softly. He didn't ask what kind. "I saw your letter to the VA, the one you filed after your wife passed." Brandon looked down. "They never read it." "Well, I did," she said. And so did the judge. A flicker crossed his face, too small to be hope, too early for relief. Cassie reached into her briefcase and pulled out a slim folder. "This is a motion to reopen your VA case under hardship protocol. It's a long shot, but I'm filing it anyway. Along with it, we're pursuing full dismissal of the charges and financial compensation." Brandon's voice was low. Why are you doing this?" She looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Because someone should have." The file lay open on the table like a battlefield unearthed. Pages of faded commendations, combat reports, and scribbled letters formed a paper mosaic of a life no one had bothered to remember until now. Brandon sat in the visitation room of the holding facility, sleeves rolled to the elbows, fingertips brushing across the edge of a Bronze Star citation that had once been framed in a dusty military office. Now it was paper-clipped between yellowing medical denials and case notes from overworked VA staff. Cassie sat across from him silent. She had let him read in peace. Now, as the silence stretched too long, she finally spoke. "You never told anyone about this." Brandon looked up. His voice was rough from disuse. "Who would care I do?" she said, simple and unwavering. He studied her face for a moment, expecting pity maybe. But there was only fire in her eyes, not sympathy. Solidarity. He leaned back and stared at the fluorescent light above. "I never asked for that medal," he said, tapping the citation. "Didn't even know they put me in for it until a lieutenant handed it to me on the tarmac." "You saved 5 men from a burning building while under sniper fire," Cassie said. "That's not just bravery. That's extraordinary valor." Brandon shook his head. "I was just the last one standing. 15 years earlier. Fallujah, Iraq. Smoke curled through the windows like fingers reaching for throats. The building had taken a direct hit, and the second story was collapsing in sections. Screams rang out, half-choked orders, half prayers. Brandon's boots hit the sand hard as he raced back toward the flames. A sergeant tried to grab his arm. "It's too late, Cole." But he shrugged him off. "They're not dead yet," he growled. He ducked beneath a burning beam, pulled the first Marine free by the vest, dragging him toward the door. Twice he slipped in blood or debris. The air was thick with smoke and grit, his eyes burning. The second man had a broken femur and was fading fast. Brandon lifted him over his shoulder like a sack of flour and kept moving. The third was barely conscious, pinned under a desk. Then came the sniper fire. Brandon hit the ground, hard, dragging the man over him, shielding him with his own body. And somehow, he made it back. They tried to give him a standing ovation later at camp. He didn't attend the ceremony. Instead, he was in the medical tent, holding the hand of the 4th Marine who hadn't made it. Present day. Holding facility. Brandon's voice was a whisper now. "You know what the Bronze Star got me when I got home?" Cassie didn't answer. A 2-minute handshake at the airport and a pile of paperwork no one ever explained. He tapped the rejection letter. "My wife died waiting for a surgery that was supposed to be approved. I called 3 times. No answer. I sent letters. They misplaced the file." Cassie's throat tightened. "And Sophie?" "She was 6. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Woke up that morning asking where Mommy was. I didn't know how to tell her. So I made pancakes." He looked down at his hands. "I've been making pancakes ever since." Cassie swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in her throat. Brandon continued almost absently. "I applied for VA support again after that. Missed the appeal deadline. 3 days late. They said I'd need legal counsel to refile." He gave a half laugh. "You know how many janitors can afford a lawyer?" Cassie leaned forward. "You should have been protected." "I wasn't." His voice was steady, not angry, just tired. "And I'm not the only one." Later that day, Cassie walked the steps of the town's veteran memorial alone. The snow was falling gently now, coating the bronze statues and stone etchings with a soft silence. She traced the names carved into the wall, some she knew only through case files. Others she had met in courtrooms and hospital rooms. She paused in front of one plaque that read, "All gave some gave all." And some were forgotten entirely. The next morning in court, Cassie stood before the judge, flanked by Brandon, and submitted a motion into the record. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "this is more than a petty theft case. It's a mirror to the system that abandoned the very people who fought for it." Brandon Cole didn't steal out of greed. He took bread and milk to keep a promise to his daughter, a promise made at his wife's grave. That promise should not have required a courtroom to defend. She held up the folder. "We are submitting documented evidence of denied appeals, ignored claims, and a procedural failure that stripped this man of everything he was owed. I'm also requesting a formal reopening of his VA case and an ethics review of how his paperwork was handled." There was a pause. Then a voice spoke from the back row. "I was there," said an older man standing slowly. "Fallujah. Cole pulled me out too." Heads turned. Another stood. Then another. 3 veterans. 4. 6. Some wore caps. Some stood with canes. But all looked forward with the same unwavering respect. One by one they rose. Not in protest, not in anger, in testimony. Cassie turned to Judge Beckett, and the judge, for the first time in his long career, removed his robe, folded it, and stepped down from the bench to stand with them, beside Brandon. "Let the record show," Beckett said softly, "we are not just reviewing a case. We are correcting a wrong." By 9 a.m., the benches were full. Not just occupied full. Every row in courtroom 3B was lined with people, old men in worn camouflage jackets, middle-aged women clutching handkerchiefs, teenagers holding support, our veterans' signs. Cameras buzzed quietly in the corners as local reporters whispered into handheld mics. Even the bailiff looked startled by the sheer volume of humanity that had gathered for what was supposed to be a misdemeanor theft case. Outside, a light snow had started falling again, softening the sidewalks, but not the mood. Inside, it felt like history had walked into the room and taken a seat in the front row. Cassie stood beside Brandon at the defense table. She could feel the pressure building in the room, the weight of expectation, of curiosity, of unspoken judgment. But Brandon. He stood still as stone, his olive coat clean but threadbare, his hands resting calmly on the table. He wore no tie today, no badge of honor, just the tired dignity of a man who had run out of things to prove. Judge Charles Beckett entered from the rear chamber face, composed but solemn. The room rose as one not just in formality, but as if rising to bear witness. The hearing began. Prosecutor Scott Bruner adjusted his tie and approached the podium. He was younger than most of the room, and today it showed. "Your Honor," he began. "While the facts of this case are undisputed, Mr. Cole did leave the store without paying. We must acknowledge the unique circumstances surrounding it. However," he paused, sensing the gaze of dozens. "However he continued, our justice system depends on fairness, on consistency. If we allow public sympathy to outweigh law, we risk undermining the very principles we seek to uphold." There was a faint murmur from the crowd. Someone scoffed audibly. Cassie stood. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "Mr. Bruner speaks of law. I speak of justice." She walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom, holding in her hand a single sheet of paper. The rejection notice from the VA dated 1 week after Marissa Cole's funeral. She held it up. This is what the system handed a grieving father 3 days after he buried his wife. Not compassion, not aid. Paperwork. She turned to face the crowd, not just the judge. This case is not about whether Brandon Cole took bread and milk. It's about whether we, as a community, still recognize integrity when it walks among us in worn boots and a tired coat. She took a breath, her voice steady but fierce. "You want to know why he didn't ask for help? Because every time he did the door shut in his face, he wasn't asking for a parade. He just wanted to feed his daughter." Cassie paused, and for that he's here on trial. Judge Beckett leaned forward. Mr. Cole. Would you like to speak for yourself? Brandon's chair creaked as he stood. He didn't walk to the podium. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked around the room at the strangers, the veterans, the reporters, the judge, and said quietly, I promised my wife I'd never let our little girl go to bed hungry. He looked down at his hands. I broke that promise once, the night my wife died. I couldn't save her. I held Sophie in my lap while the snow fell through the roof, and I couldn't explain to her why a hospital built to save lives had let hers slip away. He looked up. I've made mistakes. I'm not proud of everything I've done. But I've kept my promise ever since. I've worked every job they'd give me, janitor, dishwasher, snow shoveler. I never asked for special treatment. Just enough to keep my daughter safe. He gestured toward Sophie, who sat near the back beside a veteran in a wheelchair. She was clutching her dad's scarf again. When I walked into that store, I wasn't thinking about consequences. I was thinking about pancakes. The room chuckled softly, not mockingly, but with the sound of shared understanding. Brandon continued. That's all it was. Just pancakes. And a little girl with a fever, who deserved better than stale cereal and an empty fridge. He turned to the judge. I don't ask for pity. I ask you to look at me and tell me I deserve a record for trying to feed my kid. Silence. Then someone in the back stood. It was the veteran from Chapter 7, the first to recognize Brandon. He raised a wrinkled hand. Permission to speak, Your Honor. Judge Beckett nodded slowly. The man stepped forward with difficulty, gripping a cane with a Marine emblem etched into the handle. He faced the crowd. I was there, he said, voice like gravel. Fallujah. 2004. A lot of us didn't think we'd make it. But we did. Because of him. He pointed to Brandon. He dragged 3 of us out of a building that was about to collapse. He caught a round in the shoulder doing it. Never told anyone. Just kept going. I was the 4th man. My leg was gone below the knee, but he still lifted me over his back. Another voice rose. He saved me too. Then another. He pulled my brother out of a minefield. Voices rose from the crowd, one after another, some shaking, some defiant, all speaking truth, into a room that had for too long only whispered about injustice. Judge Beckett stood. What he said next would go on to be quoted in newspapers, in blog posts, in courtrooms across the country. But in that moment, it wasn't about headlines. It was about restoration. I've been on this bench for 30 years. I've presided over capital cases, political trials, corporate corruption. But today, I see clearer than I have in a long time. He looked at Brandon. You stood for us when the country called. And when you fell through the cracks, we looked the other way. He turned to the crowd. This hearing isn't about one man's actions. It's about ours. About whether we still recognize honor in clothes that don't shine. About whether we choose bureaucracy or decency. He paused. And I choose decency. The courtroom doors creaked open again. And this time, the entire room turned to look. 3 men stepped in slowly, deliberately. They wore suits that didn't quite fit, and carried themselves with the uneasy grace of people not used to being noticed. But there was something unmistakable about them, something in the way they walked, in the lines on their faces, in the stillness behind their eyes. Combat veterans. The 4th to enter was in a wheelchair. The 5th used a cane. Each wore a simple pin on their lapel, a branch insignia, a campaign ribbon, or the familiar eagle globe and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. Brandon noticed them immediately. His back straightened. His breath caught. His hands curled slightly at his sides. Cassie leaned toward him, whispering, Do you know them? He nodded, eyes fixed on the men as they filed into the pews near the front. Everyone. Judge Beckett looked down from the bench, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. The court recognizes several of these men from submitted testimony. But I understand one of you has requested to speak in person. An older man, mid-60s, with a deep scar running across his jawline, rose slowly. I do your honor. The bailiff brought him forward. He walked with a limp that echoed through the courtroom. When he reached the witness stand, he didn't sit. He turned, facing the room with quiet authority. My name is Sergeant Benjamin Stroud, retired. I served with the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, Fallujah, Iraq. He looked directly at Brandon. I was there the night Corporal Brandon Cole carried my bleeding body through sniper fire, across broken ground, and dropped me behind a makeshift barricade. I'd taken shrapnel to the gut and was fading. I remember begging him to leave me. He paused. His voice thickened. He didn't. A hush fell again. Sergeant Stroud's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a medal. This is my silver star. I was given this because I survived that night. But the truth is, I didn't earn it alone. If not for Cole, I'd be buried in Arlington. He placed the medal on the witness stand, the metal clinking softly against the wood. I'm here today to return what was never fully mine. He turned to the judge. And to say under oath that if we convict this man for trying to feed his child, we'll be convicting ourselves for every time we looked the other way when our heroes came home broken. He stepped down without waiting for dismissal. The next man stood. Then another. A Navy corpsman who spoke with a stutter from a traumatic brain injury described how Brandon had tied a tourniquet around his leg with a torn piece of his own sleeve while mortars rained around them. A former logistics officer who now worked as a janitor testified to Brandon's leadership, his quiet integrity. He never asked for a single thank you, the man said. But I owe him my entire life. I named my son after him. Then came the man in the wheelchair. His name was Raymond Marks. He had been on the 2nd floor of that same burning building in Fallujah. He rolled forward, his voice clear and strong. I lost both legs when the structure collapsed minutes after Cole dragged me out. He was bleeding from a shoulder wound. He could have saved himself first. He didn't. He never did. Raymond looked at the judge. For 15 years I sat in silence. I told myself it wasn't my fight to speak up. That maybe someone else would vouch for him. Maybe the system would see him. He looked at Brandon. I'm sorry it took me this long, brother. Brandon's throat tightened. He couldn't speak, but he nodded just once. And then something even more unexpected happened. A woman rose from the middle pews, blonde hair pinned back neatly, glasses, professional blouse under a tan coat. She carried a folder in her hand, and as she approached the bench, she addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, my name is Lieutenant Commander Eliza Shaw. JAG Corps retired. I served as VA liaison during the early 2010s. Cassie leaned forward, surprised. I didn't know she was coming. She wasn't, Brandon murmured. She's not one of mine. Judge Beckett allowed the woman to approach. I'm here not as a witness to Brandon Cole's military record, but as a witness to his erasure. She opened the folder. In 2013, I personally filed an internal recommendation that Corporal Cole's VA case be reevaluated after multiple delays. It was denied by a senior administrator citing backlog protocol. His appeal was never reviewed. His file was marked low priority due to lack of recent communication, which was because he was working night shifts to keep a roof over his daughter's head. Her voice was firm. I want the court to know this man did everything the system told him to do, and the system failed him again and again. She placed the file on the table beside the judge, and now it's our job to undo that failure. Judge Beckett sat in silence for a moment. Then he turned to the courtroom. I want the record to show that over a dozen veterans men who served beside the defendant, who owe their lives to him, have testified on his behalf. That evidence has been submitted of gross mishandling of VA documentation. That a child, Sophie Cole, stands as living proof of a father who never gave up. He looked back at Brandon. Mr. Cole, do you have anything to say before we adjourn for verdict? Brandon stood slowly. His voice was quiet, yet carried. I didn't ask anyone to come here. I didn't ask anyone to speak. I thought I was alone in all this. He glanced toward Sophie, her eyes wide, hands clasped over her heart. But maybe I wasn't. He looked at the veterans now seated beside one another, uniformed not by cloth, but by history sacrifice and loyalty. Maybe none of us were ever truly alone. We just forgot how to stand up for each other. As the judge declared the court in recess until the formal verdict, not a soul moved from their seat. Not one. Because in that moment, every person in that room, prosecutor, janitor, teacher, mechanic, clerk, knew they had just witnessed something bigger than a trial. They had witnessed a reckoning. And the beginning of redemption. The final morning of the hearing dawned with a quiet solemnity, as though even the snow refused to fall too loudly. The streets outside the courthouse were lined with silent figures, veterans in uniform, neighbors in work coats, mothers holding children bundled in scarves. A small-town hush had spread through every diner, every grocery aisle, every school hallway. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere was not tense, it was reverent. Brandon Cole sat beside Cassie at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him. He wore the same olive-green coat, pressed as best he could, and a freshly shaven face that only made the lines under his eyes more visible. Beside him, Sophie held tightly onto his hand. She hadn't let go since they'd arrived. Judge Charles Beckett entered quietly. There was no call to rise. Somehow, everyone already had. He took his seat and scanned the room. I will now read the court's ruling. A pause. In the matter of the state versus Brandon Samuel Cole, the court finds the defendant not guilty. No explosion, no applause, no gasps, just silence. Still, complete. The kind of silence that wraps itself around a room, not out of shock, but out of respect. Judge Beckett continued, his voice low but steady. It is the opinion of this court that Mr. Cole's actions, though technically unlawful, were motivated not by greed or disregard for the law, but by necessity, devotion, and moral conviction. When systems fail, the measure of a man is what he does to protect those he loves. Mr. Cole did not steal for himself. He fulfilled a promise, and no court should ever punish that. He looked directly at Brandon. In addition to dismissal of all charges, the court formally recommends immediate review and reinstatement of Mr. Cole's veteran benefits by the Department of Veterans Affairs. His Bronze Star status and service record will be submitted for full restoration. He then removed a sealed folder from the bench and slid it toward the bailiff. This court also invokes its discretionary authority to recommend Mr. Cole for the State Medal of Civil Merit. A stir moved through the courtroom, but still no one spoke. Brandon blinked, slowly, stunned. Cassie squeezed his arm. Sophie looked up at her father, lips trembling. Does that mean? Yes, baby, he whispered, voice cracking. It means we can go home. Judge Beckett stood breaking from years of tradition and descended from the bench once more. His robe flowing behind him, he crossed the courtroom floor and stopped directly in front of Brandon. Without hesitation, he extended his hand. Mr. Cole, he said softly, this country owes you more than I can put into words. Brandon rose to his feet. Slowly. Not out of hesitation, but out of reverence for the moment. He accepted the judge's handshake. They stood there, two men forever linked, not just by war, but by accountability, by time, by redemption. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, people in the courtroom began placing their right hand over their chest. Not in salute, not as a command, but as a gesture of recognition. The veterans, the social worker, the young mother, the grocery clerk, even the bailiff. It spread like a wave of quiet gratitude. No words, no clapping. Just a shared silence so powerful it could bring a nation to its knees. Sophie, standing beside her father, mirrored the gesture, her small hand pressed to her heart, eyes shining. Brandon looked down at her, then back at the room. His voice was low. "I'm no hero." Judge Beckett shook his head gently. "No, but you reminded us how heroes are forgotten and how they should be remembered." After the court adjourned, Brandon stepped out into the cold morning light to find a crowd waiting. Dozens had gathered outside holding signs that read, "Honor the forgotten." Heroes shouldn't go hungry. Thank you, Corporal Cole. Local news vans were parked along the curb, reporters preparing to broadcast. But no one rushed him. No microphones were shoved in his face. The crowd simply parted. And as Brandon and Sophie walked through, they were met with quiet nods, glistening eyes, and murmured words like, "Thank you. You made us proud again. Semper Fi, brother." Cassie followed behind, blinking back tears. When they reached the steps, a young man in dress blues, Marine Corps, stepped forward. "I'm Private First Class Elijah Monroe," he said, saluting crisply. "I enlisted because of men like you, sir." Brandon hesitated, then returned the salute, slow, grounded, precise. "Make it count," he said. The young Marine's eyes welled. "I will." Hours later, Brandon stood alone in the empty courtroom. The reporters were gone. The crowd dispersed. Cassie had taken Sophie home to rest. She'd insisted they celebrate later pancakes and warm cocoa. But Brandon had asked for a moment. He stood at the defense table and stared at the now empty bench. Then he walked to the witness stand, the place where others had spoken for him when he could not find the words. He placed something on the wood, his dog tag, then turned and walked away. The soft clatter of falling snow echoed faintly through the courthouse corridors as the last of the spectators filtered out. Courtroom 3B, once packed with tension and testimony, now stood quiet, save for the distant hum of a cleaning crew vacuuming the marble floor down the hall. Brandon Cole stood near the courtroom doors, his olive coat buttoned neatly, holding Sophie's hand. The storm inside him had passed, but he still felt like a man walking through the wreckage of something vast, something sacred. Cassie approached from the judge's chambers, her arms crossed, but face warm. "It's done," she said softly. "The dismissal paperwork is being finalized. No probation, no record, just freedom." Brandon nodded. "You saved us." Cassie shook her head. "No, you reminded people what saving means." Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve. "Can we go now, Daddy?" Brandon knelt beside her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "Yes, baby. We're going home." Before they could take a step, a voice called from the rear hallway. "Mr. Cole." They turned. It was Scott Bruner, the assistant district attorney, who had opened the trial with cool detachment and legal precision. But now the lines of arrogance that had once shaped his expression had softened. His briefcase was at his side untouched. His tie hung loose around his collar, and his eyes, usually sharp, calculating, held something raw. Regret. He approached slowly, as though unsure whether he had the right to. "I was wrong," he said, hands in his coat pockets. "About everything." Brandon studied him. "You did your job." Bruner shook his head. "No, I played a role. There's a difference." He let out a long breath. "I looked at your case and saw an easy win. A man who'd broken the law, a clear violation. But I didn't look deeper. I didn't ask why. I didn't want to." Sophie moved closer to her dad. Bruner noticed. "I watched you hold her hand through this entire process. You didn't need a lawyer to make you look like a good father. You just were." Cassie narrowed her eyes slightly. Is there a reason you're here? Mr. Bruner looked at her with a rare sincerity. Yes, to say something I've never said in court before. He turned back to Brandon. I'm sorry. Brandon studied him. For a long beat, he said nothing. Then he extended his hand. Bruner hesitated, then took it. The handshake wasn't long, but it was enough. I hope you stay in this job long enough to fix it from the inside, Brandon said. Bruner's voice dropped. So do I. As he turned to leave, he paused, looking at Sophie. I hope your next pancakes come with strawberries. She smiled shyly. They will. In the parking lot, the air smelled of cold steel and wet asphalt. Cassie had offered to drive them home, but Brandon declined. Someone had returned his old pickup from impound. The engine sputtered like an old dog stretching its legs, but it still ran. Sophie curled up in the passenger seatbelt, tight face tilted toward the window where snow was melting in little rivers. She hummed softly some old lullaby her mother used to sing. Brandon started the truck, then paused. In his rearview mirror, he saw Judge Beckett stepping out onto the courthouse steps. Alone, still in his robe, hands clasped behind him, as if standing guard over something ancient. Brandon opened the door and stepped out. The judge saw him and waited. They met halfway down the walk. You forgot something, Beckett said, holding out the dog tag. Brandon looked at it. No, he said. I didn't. Beckett's brow furrowed. Brandon explained. That tag used to remind me who I was. Now I don't need it to. He looked the judge square in the eye. Give it to the next soldier who forgets. Beckett stared at him, eyes misted. You know, when you pulled me out of that rubble, I thought I owed you my life. Brandon raised a brow. You didn't. Beckett shook his head. No, I owed you my respect, and I should have given it sooner. He extended his hand this time, not as a judge, but as a man, a soldier, a peer. Brandon shook it. Beckett smiled faintly. You're free to go, sir. Brandon nodded. Yes, sir. I am. Back on the road, the pickup rolled steadily through the winding streets of the town. Streetlights flickered on, casting golden halos through the snowfall. Sophie dozed in her seat, bundled in her scarf, her fingers loosely holding a folded paper in her lap. It was her drawing, one she'd made the night before. It showed a man in a green coat, holding hands with a little girl. Above them, a sun smiled over a small house with a chimney. In crayon, she had written, "Home again." Brandon glanced at her, then back at the road. For the first time in years, his chest didn't ache from holding something in. And as the truck disappeared into the falling dusk, the weight of the war, the trial, the silence, the years, it all stayed behind him. The past didn't vanish. It just stopped defining him. It had been 3 days since the courtroom fell into silence. 3 days since Brandon Cole walked out, a free man no longer defined by charges, scars, or silence, but by something deeper, the dignity of having been seen. The town hadn't forgotten him, not this time. Cards had started arriving, handwritten notes from strangers and old friends, some with $5 bills folded inside. Veterans offered free repairs on his truck. The local diner left a seat open for him and Sophie every morning, no questions asked. But Brandon didn't quite know what to do with peace. He moved through his modest home, like it might disappear if he exhaled too deeply. The heater still knocked in the walls. The refrigerator still hummed like a low conversation. The floorboards creaked in familiar protest. But something had changed. Sophie. She had started humming again while she did her homework. Her appetite returned, along with her insistence on too much syrup on pancakes. At night, she asked for stories, not bedtime tales, but real ones. Stories about her mom, about when she was born, about the night Brandon proposed with a paper ring folded from a deployment letter. He gave her everything she asked for. He owed her that much. That morning, a light snow dusted the porch. Brandon stepped outside in his flannel shirt and boots to retrieve the mail. Bills, coupons. A letter from the VA this time with the words, "Reinstatement confirmed," stamped in red. But what caught his eye was the small package at the bottom of the stack. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. No return address, just a name written carefully in ink, Clara Simmons. He froze. It had been nearly 5 years since he'd heard that name. Clara had been Marissa's niece, her sister's daughter. Brandon hadn't seen her since the funeral, when grief had pulled everyone into separate orbits. There had been a falling out, maybe, or just silence, the kind that grows thicker the longer no one speaks. Brandon brought the package inside and sat at the table, hands trembling slightly, as he untied the twine. Inside was a scarf. Red. Worn but intact. And instantly familiar. He blinked hard. It was Ellie's. Ellie had been Marissa's childhood nickname, a name only her sister's family ever used. The scarf had been hers passed down to Sophie when she was 5. It had disappeared during the funeral, lost in the chaos. But here it was, folded neatly. Beneath it, a note, Uncle Brandon. I found this while going through my mother's things. I thought Sophie should have it back. I don't know if this will reach you, but I've thought about you both more times than I can count. I live in Auburn now. I never knew how to reach out until I realized I had to try. If Sophie wants to meet me, I'd be honored. Clara Brandon exhaled slowly. For a long time he just sat there, the scarf in his hands. Then a small voice came from behind him. Daddy Sophie stood in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep, but her eyes instantly locked on the scarf. She gasped. "That's..." He nodded. "It's your mom's." Or, it was. "Then it was yours." She crossed the kitchen reverently, picking up the scarf like it was made of glass. "Where did you find it?" she asked. "I didn't," Brandon said. Clara did. Sophie frowned. "Aunt Clara." He nodded. "She wrote to us." Brandon handed her the note. As she read, her lower lip quivered. When she looked up, her voice was small. "Can we write her back?" Brandon smiled. "No," he said. "We're going to do better than that." That afternoon, they drove 2 hours through snowy hills to the town of Auburn. Sophie wore the red scarf knotted gently under her chin. She had insisted. "Mom would want me to." Brandon had rehearsed what he might say. He had written down words, crossed them out, rewritten them again. But now, sitting outside a small crafts boutique with fairy lights in the windows, he realized none of it mattered. Sophie stepped out first. Brandon followed. Inside the shop, Clara was arranging ceramic mugs on a shelf. She looked up when the bell over the door rang and froze. For a moment, no one moved. Then Clara whispered, "Oh my God." She stepped forward slowly, her eyes glassy, hands rising to her mouth. Sophie blinked up at her. "Are you... really... Aunt Clara?" Clara dropped to her knees. "Yes, baby. I'm really her." Sophie flew into her arms, wrapping her tightly, burying her face in Clara's coat. "I thought I didn't have anyone," Sophie said through tears. "After Mom, it was just me and Daddy." Clara clutched her back. "You were never alone. We just lost each other." Brandon stood nearby, eyes rimmed with tears, heart hammering. Clara looked up at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I," he replied. No grand speeches, no dramatic music, just 2 people standing in a shop filled with quiet light, finding their way back to a bond neither one knew how to name. Later, the 3 of them sat in a corner cafe. Sophie told stories about school. Clara shared memories of Marissa that Brandon hadn't heard in years, like the time she dyed her hair blue to spite her chemistry teacher. Or the Christmas she saved up to buy Brandon a compass pendant when he got deployed. Brandon laughed, truly. laughed for the first time in years. And when the waitress came by and asked if they were ready to order, Sophie beamed. "Pancakes, please. With strawberries." That night, back home, Sophie tucked the red scarf under her pillow, and as Brandon turned off the light, she whispered, "Do you think Mom saw today?" He walked to her bedside, knelt, and kissed her forehead. I think she never stopped watching. The sun was setting over Hollow Creek Park, casting the small town in a golden hush that felt more like reverence than routine. Warm amber rays poured through the bare trees, painting the frozen ground in long, stretched shadows. The snow hadn't melted, but it no longer felt bitter. It shimmered like memory. Rows of folding chairs had been arranged around the small stone amphitheater near the war memorial. Blankets draped over shoulders. Thermoses passed from hand to hand. Flags fluttered gently in the breeze. And at the center of it all stood a makeshift podium wrapped in the red, white, and blue of a banner that read, "Hollow Creek honors its forgotten heroes." Brandon Cole adjusted the collar of his coat as he stood behind the curtain of the small park stage. He could hear the murmuring crowd on the other side, neighbors, teachers, veterans, kids from the school where he used to mop floors. Even a local congressman had shown up, though Brandon suspected it was more for the cameras than the cause. Cassie stood beside him in a navy wool coat clipboard, in hand, eyes scanning the program. "Speech ready?" she asked softly. Brandon patted the folded sheet in his inside pocket. "Doesn't mean I'll read it." Cassie smirked. "You're allowed to go off script. You earned it." Sophie peeked out from behind a curtain bundled in her red scarf. "There are so many people out there, Daddy." He looked down at her and smiled. "That's because we're not invisible anymore." On the other side of the crowd, Judge Beckett sat with Clara Simmons, who held Sophie's hand tightly in hers. Behind them were veterans, some in uniform, others in civilian coats, but unmistakably marked by bearing and brotherhood. And when Brandon stepped onto the platform, they all rose to their feet. But this time, there was no gavel, no courtroom, only stillness and respect. The mayor stepped to the microphone first, giving a short and emotional introduction. "We are gathered here today not to correct the past, but to honor the perseverance of a man who survived it. A man who reminds us that heroes don't always wear ribbons, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep showing up for someone you love." He turned. "And now I invite to the stage Corporal Brandon Samuel Cole." Applause rose, not thunderous, but steady and warm, like a fire being stoked in a hearth. Brandon walked slowly to the podium, heart pounding harder than it had during any court appearance. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some not, but all watching with the quiet reverence usually reserved for memorials. He took a deep breath, unfolded the paper from his pocket, then folded it back again. His voice, when it came, was low, but carried through the still evening air like the first crackle of dawn. "I've been called a lot of things these past few weeks," he began. "Veteran, hero, defendant, father." He paused, but for a long time I wasn't called anything at all. A ripple of stillness passed through the crowd. There were years, he continued, where I was just a pair of hands pushing a mop, a guy with a faded coat, a man people pitied quietly or passed by altogether. And I was okay with that, because I had Sophie, and she still saw me. He turned to where she sat in the front row, beaming up at him. "I didn't come here today to talk about medals, or war, or government failures. I came to talk about promises." A breeze stirred through the trees. "I made one once at my wife's graveside. I promised I'd keep Sophie warm, fed, and loved, that I'd never let her feel alone. And I broke that promise. The night I got arrested." He paused, letting the memory settle. But something happened after that. People I didn't know stood up for me. They remembered me even when I'd forgotten how to see myself. He looked out over the crowd. His voice softened. Sometimes a hero isn't the one who rushes into fire. Sometimes it's the little girl who refuses to let her father be forgotten. Sometimes it's the lawyer who takes your case for free. The judge who remembers your name. The town that finally chooses to look again. A long silence. Then Brandon reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, his dog tag. He held it up. This tag used to remind me of who I was, but I don't need it anymore to know. Then he turned and walked to the memorial behind him. He placed the tag gently on the cold granite slab where dozens of names had been etched in bronze. He stood in silence, and one by one others stood beside him. Veterans, neighbors, a janitor, a teacher, a girl with a red scarf. No one said a word. No one needed to. As the sun finally slipped beneath the horizon, lights strung around the park flickered on soft golden glowing. The mayor returned to the podium one last time. We end tonight not with fanfare, but with light. Because sometimes the people who carry us through the darkest hours aren't always visible. Until now. A quiet cheer spread through the crowd. Children handed out small lanterns, glass jars filled with warm, flickering lights. Everyone held them high. And in that moment, the park shimmered like the night sky had bent down to meet the earth. Sophie stood on stage beside her father, holding his hand with one and her lantern with the other. Her red scarf fluttered softly. Brandon knelt down beside her and whispered, "What do you think, baby?" She smiled. "I think Mom would have loved this." He nodded. "So do I. We'd love to know where are you watching from. Whether you're from a small town like Hollow Creek or a big city across the world, your presence here means the world to us. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to Soul Moments Story for more true-to-life inspiring tales of kindness, courage, and quiet heroes that often go unseen. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.